All right, hello everybody, and welcome to Finnish in 45 minutes. So if you are coming to this presentation, I have to assume you're interested in studying Finnish, or perhaps have maybe learned a little bit of it. If that is something you've been doing or something you've expressed interest in doing, you've probably encountered people who were surprised that you're interested in trying to tackle such a difficult language, or like to go on and on about how Finnish is really, really hard. And usually they'll cite things like how Finnish has a lot of cases, or maybe something like consonant gradation, depending on how much linguistics they know, or just the fact that none of the words in Finnish, or that many of the words in Finnish are unrelated to words you already know because it isn't ultimately an Indo-European language, or any of a variety of other horror stories. Now, while there's some truth to the fact that Finnish does not have as much vocabulary in common with English or other sort of more standard average European languages as something like Spanish or Italian might, these things really aren't as scary as they sound. So for the purpose of this talk, I'd like you to forget all of those horror stories. Forget that anyone ever told you Finnish was hard. It really isn't that bad. Of course, learning any language is going to require years of effort and memorizing thousands of words and morphemes and things like that. But Finnish isn't as bad as people make it out to be. If you can study Spanish, you can study Finnish. So first off, Finnish is made up of more or less the same sorts of parts as other languages. Things like there's words, there's nouns and verbs, and you can put roots together and add suffixes and conjugate verbs and things like that. Yes, you have to learn those parts, it's true, but there's really nothing you haven't seen before. A lot of the things that are traditionally considered confusing are not all that confusing once you learn how they actually work. They aren't all that different than the things you'd have to learn for German, for instance. So if we start with cases, again, I'm going to ask you for a moment to forget everything you've heard about Finnish cases. Imagine you just dropped in the middle of Finland or in a Finnish class for some reason, and you don't know anything about the language. Try and forget that Finnish even has cases, that you're just approaching it as you would any other language. And I'm going to give you an example sentence. Hän asuu Oulussa. That means she lives in Oulu, or he lives in Oulu. There's no gender distinction. Does that look confusing at all? There's no way to answer given how these talks are done, but I'm going to assume that few people will find this particularly confusing. The Finnish sentence is more or less the same as the English one, except for the fact that the preposition and the noun at the end of the sentence have swapped places. So you say literally, he or she lives Oulu in. Now, yes, you have to learn that, but it's not all that different than English or Spanish. So why should it be harder when it's written like this? This is what that sentence would actually look like in traditional written Finnish. And also Oulussa. Now that sa is a case ending, or traditionally considered a case ending. That means more or less in. Although I will give the caveat that it does not have the exact same meaning as the English preposition in, but that's true for any other language. Spanish en, German in, Russian v do not mean exactly the same thing as in English. So why should Finnish be any different? This is more or less how, I'm going to say 12 of the 15 cases that Finnish is traditionally described as having works. So they more or less correspond to prepositions in other languages. They're not, and of course they might not have exactly the same meaning as the preposition that you'll see if you look them up in a table somewhere, but again, you've encountered that before if you've done any other language. There's always variation in how words like that are used. So yeah, I already said the part about almost all Finnish cases work like prepositions in French or German or Spanish or something like that. There are three that might be somewhat new to you if you've never studied a case language before: the genitive, accusative, and partitive. But of those, I would say even only the partitive is even vaguely confusing. If you know what a direct object is, accusative is pretty easy to master as a concept. And genitive as well is that's just how you mark possession. It's the same thing as apostrophe S in English, or de or de in Spanish or French, something like that. And there's only three of those. So even if you have trouble with all of them, all of a sudden your big scary list of 15 cases has been reduced to 4, the nominative plus these 3. So don't let the case system scare you away. If you're interested in learning Finnish, approach the cases as if they were prepositions. And then just remember that they go at the end of the word instead of before it. That'll be easy to remember because Finnish also has a lot of actual, very, very clearly actual postpositions. And they are no trouble at all. They work exactly the way you'd expect them to most of the time, except they go after the word instead of before. So, all right. Another thing that often scares people is consonant gradation. What about all these forms of consonant gradation? Do I have to memorize them all? Ones like mekko, mekot. So, well, let's skip ahead for a second. Do a quick overview of what consonant gradation is in case someone isn't particularly familiar with it yet. So a lot of Finnish words have these internal stem changes that happen when they're put in a particular grammatical form. Often the plural is probably the best example. So like häntä, tail becomes hännät in the plural, not häntät. You add the t at the end, but then you also have to turn the nt into an nn. Kerta, a time, becomes kerran in the genitive. Nahka, leather, becomes nahan. It can also be nahkan. There's a little bit of dialectal variation there, but we'll stick with this version for this discussion. So mekko, mekot, tahtoa, tahdon. Mekko is address. Mekot is dresses. Tahtoa is to desire to do something, basically. Do you have to memorize all of these changes? No, not really. So let's take a bit of a detour and talk about phonology. So if you haven't studied any phonology, if you've studied phonology, this table is probably pretty familiar to you. If you haven't, this is basically this is more or less the sounds used in Finnish. And sounds can be divided up according to their place of articulation, which is more or less where your tongue is touching the roof of your mouth or pointed at in your mouth when you're pronouncing the sound, and manners of articulation, which is the column on the left, referring to sort of what you're doing with the airflow, more or less. So to pronounce a stop, you block the airflow through your mouth using your tongue or your lips. So like labials are made with the lips, so b is made by blocking the airflow with your lips. D is made by blocking it with your tongue against your teeth. And the k is made by blocking the airflow with the back of your tongue against the velum. So in fricatives, the airflow is not blocked, it keeps going. So s is made with your tongue against sort of the ridge behind your teeth, the alveolar ridge. And the H is a h, it's friction in like the further back in your throat. Phonologists argue over what's actually going on there sometimes, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, the important part of that is not how these sounds are actually articulated. The important part is the chart, is the fact that they can be split up they can be categorized nicely into these columns. Remember this chart because it's important for the stuff you'll see on the next slide. So Finnish consonant gradation can be more or less summarized in these 4 simple rules. The first one applies only to stops. So if you have a consonant cluster and it ends in a double stop, two p's, two t's, or two k's, and to be clear, in the strong grade, in the dictionary form, well, let's just say the dictionary form for now, such as mekko, for the word for dress, then when you gradate the cluster, that is when you add a suffix that requires consonant gradation, you delete one of those stops. So mekko becomes mekot. Kartta, a map, becomes kartat. So the three sounds across the top, put and k. Ignore the D for now because it works a little bit differently. We'll get to that. So the second rule is that if a nasal consonant, or an the is not. First of all, I should say the in Finnish does not have its own character. An N before a k says and also ng is pronounced as a long ng. So if a nasal or a liquid, that is an in the nasal row in this chart, or the liquid row, the row at the bottom, or l, if either of them is followed by a stop with the same place of articulation, so followed by p, n followed by t, r followed by t, l followed by t, or followed by k, then its gradated version, its weak version, is just a long version of that nasal or liquid consonant. Remember, ng is pronounced ng. So pinta, meaning surface, in the plural becomes pinnat. Helsinki, in the genitive, is Helsingin. That's probably the easiest way to remember it. If you remember the table of sounds from the previous slide, that's the way to remember how to get the weak version of any of those clusters. Rule number 3 is unfortunately probably the most complicated of them, but there's once you just have to memorize it at the end of the day, and it's not it makes a lot more sense when you look at the chart. So p becomes v, t becomes d, and k can become a variety of things, but mostly it just disappears. So if we look back at our sound chart, our labial stop becomes a labial semivowel. Our coronal stop, our th, becomes a d, which in many languages is a stop, and in Finnish it is often pronounced as a stop, but historically in Finnish, that d used to be a the, a voiced dental fricative, and in many modern dialects it is pronounced as a tap, a d, or, well, a variety of different things can happen to it. So it's not really a stop. You can think of it as almost a semivowel. It patterns with the v, certainly. And most of the time, while k, a single k, will just disappear, before an e or an e, it will often become a y, which, now it's not the same place of articulation, but it's about as close as you can get to the semivowel equivalent of a k. And e's and a's are known for triggering palatalization in many, many languages, so that isn't all that surprising either. Finally, the last case where the k becomes a v between two u's or two u's, you can just memorize it if you want, but you can also remember that u and u, being rounded vowels, are really, really going to want to trigger labialization of a nearby consonant. So it's not all that surprising that the k becomes a labial semivowel in that case, as opposed to simply disappearing or doing something else. If we look at the historical phonology, which I unfortunately forgot to put on the slide, k originally became a g in Finnish. So teko, teot, a deed or deeds, as in something you do, not title to a house, would have originally been teko, terot. And then the g disappeared in many, many cases, except between two high rounded vowels where it became a v, or in a few other cases. And finally, if there's an S or a T before a consonant, that blocks gradation entirely. So matka, meaning a trip, the plural of that is matkat. It is very tempting at first to say matat, but it is not. That is not correct. Matka, matkat. So yeah, in pretty much all other cases, there will be no gradation. There are also some words in which gradation doesn't occur. It's true that some of them you just need to memorize, but there are categories that tend not to undergo gradation at all. Relatively recent loanwords is one of them. Also a lot of names, including some fairly Finnish sounding names. Although not all of them. Pekka definitely becomes Pekan, but certainly if you had a foreign name, if you had I don't know, Aliette or something like that, would it be Alietten probably. So yeah, keep in mind that if you encounter a foreign word, it probably won't undergo any sort of gradation at all. There's also some amount of dialectal variation, but don't worry about that right now. Just learn the standard language. The dialects will come later. But let's take a look at another interesting case and look at how it isn't actually as surprising as it appears. If you've been thinking of consonant gradation as primarily a grammatical phenomenon, you might be tempted to think that in the plural or in the genitive, that marker just sort of requires the quote unquote weak grade. And that the base form of the word will always be in the quote unquote strong grade. But what about the word sade, rain, which has sateen in the genitive, where it's very clear that the genitive has the strong form? Or koe, meaning a test. The plural is kokeet. Or varvas, a toe on your foot. Plural varpaat. So as it turns out, gradation has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with grammar, at least historically. It's maybe become a little bit connected to grammar nowadays, but it is more or less a purely phonological phenomenon. Gradation originally arose in closed syllables. So varvas, varpaat, varvas, that last syllable of the second syllable of that word, as you can see, is closed. There's an S at the end. The plural, why we have the strong grade there, originally that syllable was open. Originally that long vowel, the vat in varpaat, was actually two syllables. At one point, I even have that on the slide here. At one point, these words would have had two syllables in their plural forms. So sateet would have been something like sadek, sateket. Varvas, varpaat would have been varvas, varpaset, or varpasat, or something like that. And then the s disappeared due to sound change, due to a sound change. And in words like sade that end with an E, there's an unwritten glottal stop at the end of the word. So even in modern Finnish, at least for many speakers, at the end, sade still ends in a closed syllable, even then though you don't see it in writing. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I believe not everyone actually pronounces that glottal stop anymore, but it certainly was there historically. Historically, the singular would have been sadek. All right, now moving on to words with quote-unquote irregular stems. So another thing that can trip people up, there are some nouns in Finnish that end in E in the nominative, but then have a stem ending in E in other forms. For instance, the word for name, nimi, nimet. That looks somewhat irregular, doesn't it? Because there are also nouns ending in E that would pluralize simply by adding a th. Well, not really. So underlying these nouns ultimately end in an A. And historically, that A became E at the end of a word. So really what's happening with nimet is not any sort of irregular declension. What's happening is that ultimately underlyingly the word is nime, and in the nominative, and only in the nominative, that E is becoming an E. Now, bear in mind, though, that nouns of the sare type do not belong to this group, of course. Those are the words that look like they end in an E in the nominative. They don't actually end in an A, they end in a glottal stop, or at least they did recently enough that it still can be considered to be there as far as the morphology is concerned. Now, actually, let's skip this slide and go to this one. What if I gave you this word, Vessi, meaning water? We get veden in the genitive. That doesn't look like it makes much sense, does it? Vetta in the partitive we can, well, I don't think we really have time to talk about how the partitive is formed, but the partitive is not all that big of a deal to form. The things that make it hard to use are just are more how it's used grammatically. But so Vessi veden. Ultimately, the stem of that word, of course, then is vete, and that final e became an e, and for a while it would have been veti veden. But then there was another sound change that turned th to s before e. So hence we get Vessi veden. So ultimately that noun isn't at irregular after all. Now there have been a lot of loan words into Finnish that have added other words with ti at the end of a word. So this is not, of course, a universally applicable pattern across the board, but a basic word like water, or a word for maybe a body part or something like that that has den in that has a stem ending in te will probably have a nominative ending in c due to that sound change. Now, this is the last thing I wanted to talk about here is vowel harmony. So basically, how vowel harmony works is that words with an a, an o, or an u in them cannot also have an a, an ö, or an u, and vice versa. So the way this would be described linguistically is that a word can only have back vowels or front vowels in it, and not a mix of the two. A and E don't really make a difference. Although if a word has only A's and E's in it, then it will take front suffixes. It'll take a, ö, and u in suffixes. But so the simple way to think about vowel harmony, without getting too confused, is to just remember that all the ahs and ohs in a word have to either have dots or not. And then remember that an U is pronounced the same way as an umlauted U in German. So, or there are probably other languages that use that symbol for that. As I recently realized, Finnish, the language with vowel harmony, is the language that insists on using U for that sound, whereas Estonian, the one without vowel harmony, uses the umlauted U. But yeah, think of U as an U with an umlaut, and then remember that if one vowel has dots, all the other ones need to in a particular word. With a couple of caveats, of course. A word is a root plus suffixes. Vowel harmony does not apply across compounds. So there are words like yla osa, upper part, that look like they violate vowel harmony. But they, at the end of the day, they aren't violating it. What's going on is just that they are compounds. So each individual part of the word, each individual root is following vowel harmony. It's just that it doesn't apply across compounds, because then you'd have to well, it just doesn't apply. There's no reason it couldn't in some language, but it doesn't in Finnish. Prefixes, to the extent that they exist, are treated as if they were also part of a compound verb. So vowel harmony does not apply to prefixes, but prefixes are not all that common. Prefixes that you wouldn't already think of as compound elements are not all that common. So, to summarize, Finnish really isn't that scary. It's a language, there's definitely a lot of complex stuff in it, but there's a lot of complex stuff in any language. Finnish is not that much worse than anything else. There are just a few novel things that you have to break down. And if you break those hard things down, they start looking a lot more familiar, making a lot more sense, and they become easier. And finally, and this is a rule that applies universally in language learning, and that is that there is always a pattern underneath, and you just have to find it. Irregularities do exist, but overwhelmingly, there's always some sort of pattern. You just have to figure out what it is. So, thank you. That concludes the formal part, and now I will answer some questions. All right, so someone asks, I got to ask this question yesterday in Finnish practice, but I would still like to ask what your experience is as a fluent English speaker hoping to speak Finnish in Finland. Do others respond in Finnish? It depends. My experience has been that if I speak good sort of fluent Finnish, then they'll answer in Finnish. But if I make a mistake, and the definition of a mistake can be a little bit broader than you'd expect if you were in Spain, for instance, or in Mexico, or somewhere that's sort of a bigger, more populated place that where it's not sort of every citizen doesn't realize they need to learn English in order to participate in global society. If you make too many mistakes, then you run the risk of someone trying to switch. I've also found that if people will assume I don't speak Finnish if they know my name. But yeah, ultimately, it really does depend. If you make too many mistakes, and if you have to ask what too many times, you do run the risk of people switching, even if you're pretty sure you could handle the situation in Finnish. I've found that the simplest way around that is to just say "mitä" until they switch back to Finnish. Because I don't want to lie and say that I don't speak English, but I do sort of want to imply that I don't. So the easy way to do that is to just say what. This in general for languages where their native speakers tend to speak English well. Just say what in the language you want to speak until the person switches back. Next question. What has been the most challenging part for you while learning Finnish, and what has been the easiest? So, honestly, the most challenging part is probably the issue in question 1, that so many Finnish people speak English so well that if you really want to use the language and you just want to dive in and speak from day one, you can run into difficulties getting people to speak to you in Finnish if you're not 100% fluent at the beginning. As I said before, though, there are strategies for getting around that, but it's not. That is the thing you should be aware of. Also, in terms of just features of the language, the trilled R is very, very difficult for me specifically, but that's very specific to me being American by birth and using mostly just R until I was 13 and started studying languages. So if you grew up speaking a language with a trilled R, that's probably not going to be as much of a problem. What has been other people do sometimes mention having issues with vowel length and the rhythm of Finnish, but I've never had a problem with that. I'm sure I don't necessarily always get it right, but it's certainly not a conceptual issue. But I also have a lot of musical background, so there's probably some correlation there. In terms of what has been the easiest thing, once you learn the system in Finnish, there are surprisingly few irregularities. There are things that, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, there are things that look irregular on the surface once you when you first look at them. But in terms of, for instance, verbs, I would say there are at most 3 irregular verbs in Finnish, and none of them are very irregular. Maybe 4, but the 4th is very clearly just a phonological process. And 2 of those 3 irregular verbs follow exactly the same pattern, nähtä and tehtä. So, and the 3rd is the verb to be, olla, which is really only irregular in the 3rd person singular and plural, I believe. I might be forgetting a form, but even that's pretty regular. So yeah. Question 3, can an ung appear in other situations than as a gradation of NK? No, not really. I'm sure there are loan words where it appears. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but in native vocabulary, ung really only exists as the weak gradated form of nka. So the next question, don't you distinguish between he and she in Finnish? Because you wrote han, if I remember correctly, and translated it with s/he. There is absolutely no grammatical gender in Finnish whatsoever. You of course, you have words for man and woman, things like that. You have a suffix tar, which is more or less equivalent to English s, in sort of making a feminine out of a traditionally masculine noun, but there is no grammatical gender whatsoever. There is no gender even on pronouns. Han is literally just means he or she or singular they. What did you think about Finnish before you started learning it? So I ultimately got into Finnish and chose to move to Finland because I was seriously into the language. I sort of came to be very interested in the grammar and the sort of logic of it, for lack of a better term. This was before I had ever even heard Finnish spoken, to be clear. I looked at it, I would mostly, this was based on what I read about it on Wikipedia and stuff like that. I thought of it as a very, very interesting language with a lot of sort of interesting grammatical stuff going on to explore, but that also managed to be pretty regular and stuff like that. And then I realized that I figured I would mesh pretty well with Finnish culture as well, and so I decided to move here. But that's a longer story. So super basic question here. You are talking about a strong and a weak form. What does this mean in Finnish? Okay, so I realized as I was talking that I should have gone deeper into this. So if we go back to the slide on consonant gradation. So basically the strong form is the form on the left, and the weak form is the form on the right. So the form with the long stop is strong, mekko, and the form with the single stop is mekot, is weak. It's just a way of referring to which sort of like which of the two gradated forms you're talking about. I mean, I'm sure there's a phonological justification for calling them strong and weak. You could call them anything you wanted, though. It's just, it exists because you can't just say the form with k and the form with one k, because you can also get, like, there isn't a word meko, at least not that I know, but if there were, it would be a perfectly valid word, but its plural would be meot. So you can't just say the form with k and the form with a single k, because you'd get confused. What sources did you use for history etymology information? So depends on whether you're asking for the talk or in general. The talk I pretty much just wrote based on things I already knew. I didn't go explicitly do much research for it. Those things I learned from a variety of places, so certain amount of Wikipedia, to be honest. But I also studied Uralic linguistics more formally, so I've had certainly seen some of these things covered in classes and stuff like that. Unfortunately, it would be difficult. I can't really give a list of sources for the talk because I didn't really consult sources when I was writing it. But if you want to ask me for places where you could read more about about these topics, you're welcome to send me an email. Question 9. How often is puhekieli spoken? So nobody speaks formal written Finnish. They can certainly read it. Like, people can certainly could produce formal written Finnish if they had to, but like, puhekieli is just the normal way to speak. But puhekieli is not necessarily the same thing as a stereotypical interpretation of what's a dialect. So, like, there is sort of definitely dialectal Finnish that isn't the same thing as just puhekieli. There is a sort of a general spoken Finnish sort of, and like, yes, I mean, as a linguist, I'm at some level obligated to say everyone has an accent. There's no such thing as a neutral language, that sort of thing. But certainly there is a general spoken Finnish that is very clearly distinct from the written form, but also isn't marked as belonging to a certain area, or at least not as strongly marked. But yeah. Is Finnish morphology ever taught like this? It makes so much more sense like this than how I've seen it described in online Finnish courses, at least for me. So I should say it's unfortunately a little bit hard for me to answer that because I've only had a limited amount of formal Finnish study. I've done a lot of my learning has been done on my own or just sort of through immersion. My experience, though, is that sources talking about Finnish grammar don't distill things down like this. They tend to just give you a big list. That's part of why I wanted to write this talk. I'm glad at least one person found this useful. because I was worried going in that it might be too technical. Can you go over the difference between vowels with umlaut? Okay, so the umlaut on an a or an o, the umlaut marks the vowel as being the equivalent front vowel. So if you don't know what a front vowel is, or a back vowel is, so a and o are, well, they're a and o, and a with an umlaut is pronounced a, and o with an umlaut is pronounced ö. The o with an umlaut is pronounced pretty much exactly the same way it would be in German. A with an umlaut is not. It's pronounced much lower. It's like more or less the same sound as in the American English cat. Slightly different, but more or less the same. Or can be compared to the A with an umlaut in many transcriptions of Swiss German as well. And for U, the front equivalent is Ü, which is pronounced the same way as a German U with an umlaut. Arguably, you could make an argument that it should be written that way, but it's not. It's not how it's written. It's written with the letter Y, and you have to live with that because that's how people write. Would you recommend starting with colloquial Finnish or the written language? That's going to depend more on you as a learner. If you're doing a speaking from day one approach, definitely start with colloquial puhekieli, because that's what your conversational partners are going to use. They'll probably be able to speak to you in written Finnish if you need them to, but they won't. That's not how they would naturally talk. But if you do much better with book learning and stuff like that, I mean, it doesn't hurt to start from the written language. Like it's not as severe as say with Icelandic, where you might end up learning where there are like almost two different sets of vocabulary. It really is just a couple of grammatical forms and plus a bunch of suffixes and common words that get shortened in colloquial language. It's relatively easy to go from written to colloquial or vice versa. Do you consider studying the Sami languages? They share some common traits with Finnish. Yes, I have studied some Northern Sami and a little bit of Skål Sami. I am not capable of producing more than a couple of words in those languages, though, unfortunately. I'd like to learn more, though, at some point. Any comment on the similarity of k to r having changed to k to 0 in both Finnish and Turkish? I mean, stops like to weaken to fricatives in the same place of articulation between vowels and in various other environments. This has happened in many different languages, many different times. And then fricatives have a way of weakening into semi-vowels and then just disappearing. There are some sound changes are more common than others in certain environments. At the end of the day, that's just sort of something that happens. You said T to D, but sare sate. There was okay. So I probably didn't explain that well enough. So what's going on with sare sateen is that in that particular word, what I was trying to explain with this pair of words, with this particular word, is that gradation is not directly tied to grammar. So it is not the case that a d is becoming a th here. What's actually happening is that the root of this word ultimately is satek, or satek with a glottal stop at the end, let's say. And when you add the genitive or plural suffix, which is the genitive is an n, but you have to add an e after if it's getting added. Well, you have to have something if it's getting added after a consonant. Which vowel it ends up being depends on various historical features. But Historically, it would have been satek, which is now and sateket. So the t becomes a d before when there's a consonant at the end of the word. It's just that in this particular word, you get the consonant, which is not written, the glottal stop at the end of that word in the nominative, but not in the genitive. I hope that made sense. I also realized that I'm used to being able to mouse around and have the mouse be visible. Oh, the mouse is visible. All right. I shouldn't be too worried about that then. All right. I hope that made sense. Feel free to send me an email or something like that if you have further questions, and thank you very much.